Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Short, sweet, and scary. Volume 1, Story 1. I grew up hearing this story. My mother would tell it from time to time. It happened to her grandmother who raised her. My great-grandmother was born in Guinea around the year 1900. No one knows what year exactly, as they weren't good at keeping records in rural Guinea in those times. Heck, they have a hard time keeping records now. Guinea is a small West African majority Muslim country. The thing with that region is you have Muslim countries which have been civilized for a while, such as Senegal, Mali, most of Guinea. But as you head east along the coast, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ivory Coast, all the way to Central Africa, you enter a zone where you had Islamic, Christian, or even Jewish civilizations mixed with patches of uncivilized pagan people who lived more inland. You might have heard about the myths of forest-dwelling cannibals told to 19th century Europeans by the coast dwellers. It's not all a myth. In some areas, once in a while, they used to eat human beings some generations back. The other African people used to warn their kids. Stories that were sort of the African equivalent of deliverance. If you ventured too far out in the boonies, no one knew what could happen to you. So great-grandma lived close to the Sierra Leone border. Around the year 1910, with her male cousin, they're riding their bikes in a remote area. Just a couple of teenagers having fun. Guinea's scenery has been called the most beautiful on earth. They rode so deep in that remote area they found themselves in a strange land. Suddenly, they saw a group of men in the distance. At first, they were unsure of their intentions. Then the men came in their direction, closer, closer, and closer. Now they're close enough for great-grandma and her cousin to recognize them. They're members of a cannibal tribe, and they're on the hunt. They attempted to pedal out of there as fast as they could, but it was too late. Their 19th century bikes couldn't reach a good speed on that rough terrain, and they couldn't outrun the men because, well, they were kids. Out of desperation, they ditched the bikes and ran to the bushes. The men lost sight of them. Cautiously, they attempted to create distance between them and the cannibals, but they realized they wouldn't be able to escape the danger zone unnoticed. That's when they saw a tall tree which they should be able to climb. They did so, still being cautious and terrified, and climbed as high as they could. From the top of the tree, they could hear the men calling them non-stop in the distance. They were trying to trick these kids into giving away their location. Who are you? Where are you from? I don't know how long they were treated, but they both escaped unharmed, scared, and with a memorable story to tell. 20 years later, my grandmother was born in the same region, and great-grandma passed away in 1973. She was a fervent believer who prayed constantly every day, and my mother swears that during the rainy season, if she needed to dry her laundry, she would pray for the rain to stop, and it would stop. The intense heat would dry everything in minutes. She would get the laundry back inside the house, and the rain would resume. Story number 2. Yeah, me and my husband, we do a lot of fishing together in one particular spot. We fish this spot every day and night. Normally, we don't have any issues. Night fishing isn't really my thing, but he enjoys it. And hey, date night, so I try not to complain too much. I've had trouble seeing my line in the water, bugs, like the smell of my shampoo, and I would just much rather be on that lake while the sun is up. It isn't uncommon for someone else who is fishing to walk up on us even after dark, chat for a few minutes, then leave without issue. We normally think nothing of it, since it's usually just other fishermen. Last summer, though, something happened that made us think twice about that. We always take a pistol with us when we're night fishing. For some reason, both of us walked out of the house without the pistol that day. It has never happened before and hasn't happened since. We got to the lake around 5 p.m. and fished with no one bothering us until around 10 p.m. At that point, the lake was empty except for one small lantern across the lake. I was sitting closest and could hear at least 2 people laughing. Out of nowhere, a man stepped out of the darkness behind me. I instinctively scooted a bit closer to my husband. The man walked over to my husband's side and asked if we've seen a black dog. Nope, sure hadn't. About this time, both my husband and I noticed, almost at the same time, that this guy has a huge machete tied to his waist. He decided to stand and talk about random stuff. talking about how he was from Louisiana, wife was teaching in Dallas, etc. Calls for his missing dog, and then the dog suddenly appears from the exact spot he had been at. As he's talking, he's walking back and forth between directly to my left and directly to my husband's right. Dog disappeared again. He finally walked over to my side again and started asking about what type of fish are swimming close enough to the surface. I inform him they're carp, then ask where his dog went. He tells me he's around somewhere, and at this point, he leaves to walk back and around the lake to his lantern. I watched him go. Normally, when folks walk up to us, I'm guarded at first but relax a bit after they leave. That wasn't happening this time, and I kept looking over my shoulder in the direction he'd have to walk over from. About 5 minutes after he left, I told my husband I wanted to leave. He laughed and talked me into waiting 20 more minutes. I made it to 10 before I noticed not one, but two flashlights headed in our direction. Every fiber of my being, every cell in my body was telling me to run. I simply told my husband, "Nope, we gotta go." Stood, grabbed what gear I could, and was up that hill to the car faster than a fat girl normally moves. He brought everything else up except for our cooler stocked with fish and ice. I locked the car and stayed behind while he went back to get it. It normally takes around 5 or 6 minutes just to get from our spot to where we parked, and that's not counting the time to get down without face planting. It's almost a straight up hill with rocky cliff for terrain. I was watching the clock. He made it down and back in just shy of 4 minutes. As he was beginning the climb and lugging that cooler, they were rounding the corner of the lake. 3 of them, and all he heard was, "Hey man, where are you going with that woman?" I really don't like night fishing now. Like I said, we don't forget that pistol since that night. Next story. About a week ago, we were sitting in our house about an hour before sunset. We live on 80 acres, about half wooded in a valley with a creek running through it. The creek empties into a river about a mile east of us. All around us are small farms. It's a very rural area. My husband was watching TV and I was on the computer. It was nice, so we had the back door open. We started hearing wood knocks. We've heard them periodically, 1 or 2 at a time, but never close to our house. I figured since all the Bigfoot shows, every third person in the woods is doing it, so I usually note where I hear it and forget about it. These were very close. We heard them over the television, which was odd. After hearing several, we got out into the yard, and in rapid succession we heard 3 very loud knocks. These were freakishly loud, and I hesitated to believe most humans could make this kind of noise. It sounded like the tree exploded. I can't overstate how very loud these were. It was in the pine-filled valley directly behind our backyard above our pond. Way too close for comfort. There are no houses back there for a couple of miles, and this was on our property. While it's not impossible someone could have walked up on us, it would be highly unusual. My husband shoots out there frequently, so it's not a safe place to walk. We all watch each other's property out there, and someone wandering around will be quickly stopped. Another thing is our 4 dogs. The first knock we heard startled them, and one of the 4 let out a quick scared bark, then nothing. These are rat terrier mixes who bark constantly. They were with us outside when we heard the loud knocks and beat us back to the house. These knocks sounded aggressive to me. I've always thought that if Bigfoot used knocks, it's for hunting communication. I think maybe we startled a group who were stalking deer in the pine thicket. Maybe we screwed up their attempts at ambushing deer, or were just too close. But they were trying to scare us off. We heard one more knock the next day, at a distance, and it's quiet now. Other things that make me wonder if we have a Bigfoot are as follows. All the pears disappeared off of our pear tree overnight this spring. None on the ground, just gone. Last summer, on 2 occasions, on windless days, I heard large dead trees crashing to the ground by the creek. Granted, that happens. We often find random young trees snapped off at about 8 or 9 feet. Probably the worst and the original reason I thought of Bigfoot is that the 3 metal fence posts we found bent over at ground height in the middle of the woods where no vehicle could drive. They are right where a game trail leads down towards the creek. Having the fence flattened makes walking over it much easier. Any of you who have been around farms No, a person can't bend these. 20 years ago, when we first moved to the farm, we heard a series of howls we just couldn't identify. Any of you who have listened to the tape of the howls that Les Stroud has, which his Survivor Man had on his program from Alaska, have heard what we heard in North Missouri that night. It went all along the creek, around our place screeching like a demon. We were both raised in the woods, husband in Arkansas, myself on the Missouri-Arkansas border, so we thought we could identify any animal back then. We could not ID that. We've never heard it again. Possibly unrelated but weird, about a year ago I found a huge wad of dark coarse hair, about 8 inches long, in our backyard. I still have it in a plastic bag. It reminds me of hair from a horsetail. We don't have horses, and our dogs don't leave our farm. I still go for walks down by my pond, past the pine thicket, but I'm very alert, and I also give myself time to feel if everything is okay before taking off. I take my dogs and my gun, but a 9mm would be no match for a large ape. By the way, I've never seen a Sasquatch, but I know of 2 people who I believe without reservation who have. It was those 2 stories, plus reading so many in other places with personal unexplained howls, that made me come to the uneasy conclusion that they're really out there. I don't want to see one. I prefer to think of them existing a million miles away. I'm thinking these things are using the creek as a travel corridor. Yes, but in truth, I really don't know what they're doing out here. Next story. Just bought a 50-acre place in very rural mountainous West Virginia with a small 100-year-old farmhouse. Nearest neighbor James is 1.5 miles away, 6 miles of dense woods to the north of me before reaching a paved road. Anyway, after buying the place, I decided to walk up my land through the narrow north hollow between 2 mountain ridges, following a north-south creek at the edge of my property. After reaching the limits of my land, I went further and came to a well-kept hunting cabin that had been described to me. Curious, I kept going north along the creek for another quarter mile, and noticed out of the corner of my eye a small, old, overgrown house set back within a mini hollow to the east of the stream. The place positively radiated creepy. There was no sidewalk to the house, and the land in front of it seemed a bit swampy. My innermost feelings said, don't go there. So I didn't go any closer and returned home. I asked the 84-year-old farmer who cuts my meadow if he knew anything about it. After about 10 seconds, he said that the house belonged to Dennis Peters, but he wouldn't say anything else about it. The original owner of my 100-year-old farmhouse was a farmer named Roscoe Peters, whose daughter Alice sold me the house and was well known to the farmer. Days later, in talking with James, I mentioned the house, and he gets this guarded look on his face, says that I might hear some strange stories about it, but he doesn't necessarily believe them, and he doesn't want to talk any more about it. Not wanting to offend my only neighbor, I dropped the subject. Weeks later, on James' recommendation, I hired Ralph, a local man, to do some indoor painting for me. Ralph, in his 50s, grew up in the area and proceeded to tell me all about the house. The house was originally owned by the older brother of Roscoe Peters, a man named Monk Peters. Monk had 2 children, Dennis and Donna. As kids, every day the pair walked 2.5 miles to a small store at the end of a dirt gravel road that I live on, bought some candy there, and walked back home. Donna was significantly retarded. Later, as a teen, Donna became pregnant and drowned her baby in the very creek that I had been following. Not knowing what had become afterwards of her, her brother Dennis at some point inherited the house and ended up being committed to the Lewis County Insane Asylum. Wow, no wonder nobody wanted to talk about it. I would suspect that a retarded teen becoming pregnant in such a hidden, isolated location with only her family around may have been a victim of incest. Her brother, later committed to an insane asylum, only deepens my suspicion. Not a place I would visit at night. No way. Next story. I grew up in suburbia, and I spent a decent amount of my youth camping both in upstate New York and slogging it through the Everglades and areas of North and Central Florida. I'll start with a story that remains with me to this day, some 20 years later. My end of the year field trip in 8th grade was up to the Peace River for 3 days of camping, canoeing, and artifacting or sifting in the Peace River. The latter, I believe, is a catalyst for my experience. Most of you know that Florida is rife with Native American history. The Peace River was an important source of water for tribes. The week prior to my trip, it had rained substantially, even by Florida standards. While sifting for fossilized manatee bones and shark teeth, our class started coming up with native clay beads, pottery shards, and arrowheads. It seemed there was a previously undiscovered virtual mound that the recent storms had unearthed and sent smaller items into the river. There were no warnings not to take anything home with us, so we gleefully took our unexpected and really cool find back to camp. That night, after the requisite campfire stories and s'mores, we went to our tents, exhausted from the several-mile canoe trip and excitement of finding a new burial mound, ready to pass out, and we did. All night, I kept being woken up by someone whispering in my ear, only to wake up and find my 2 tent mates sound asleep. The whispering was as if someone were 2 inches from my ear, and at one point, I felt the pressure of someone placing a hand upon my shoulder. It was unintelligible what was said. After the 3rd or 4th time, I was really annoyed, and nature called. It was midwinter, and growing up in southern Florida, it was really cold. And I didn't want to get out of my warm bag, but So I grudgingly got my shoes on and tried to wake one of the 2 to come with me, but to no avail. The camp was completely silent. Only some breaths and muffled snores from the tents, but no strange feelings, yet. We were way off from the campground, and I had to make a 5-10 minute walk to the outhouse. I could hear the groans of alligators, and their eyes reflected menacingly when I crossed the wooden bridge on the path to get to the main camp with the RVs. Everything went fine until I crossed that bridge on my return trip. As I was stepping off into land where gators started making strange noises, there was thrashing. I looked back, and they were leaving. After the thrashing subsided, the water became still, and I got that feeling. A slight fog was now over our camp, but kind of offset and not complete as normal fog would be. It was definitely concentrated in one small area, with my tent near ground zero. The air felt even colder, and there were no sounds from trees, which were chock full of turkey vultures. Only the sleeping sounds of my classmates and an odd pulsing heartbeat-like sound. It wasn't mine, as it was just off from my heartbeat. I heard a murmuring sound that I couldn't process, and then a few soft pops. I whipped my light over to see what I looked like and saw 2 Native Americans made of the fog, standing near a tent with a trail of fog not quite formed into more than a blob, going through one of the tents on the boys' side. They didn't react to my flashlight at all. The blob moved further into the tent through its wall, but I assumed that would have happened with or without my light, as the men standing didn't appear to react. I felt like time stood still as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I did recall that they were very detailed, yet less dense by the head than the feet, and their calves to feet were off, as it stemmed from the strange fog. What brought me back into motion was something grabbed my pant leg, and before I could scream, I saw it was a parent volunteer. She put her finger to her mouth to say quiet, and I got down and into her tent with her. She asked me if I saw it too. I'm not sure what happened next, but I know it was real as I woke up in her tent. Sadly, nothing more was said about it, only a few glances between me and the mom. I'm sure the others took their finds home, but I dug a hole where the tents were after we broke camp and buried my find of glazed Cheerio-shaped beads so that they could stay where they belonged. After our trip, my teacher received a letter from the University of Florida thanking our class and assisting to locate an unknown burial mound. There was something unique to it anthropologically, but the details are lost to my memory. I hope it was preserved enough so that those Indians could rest in peace. Next story. On November 28th of 2014, my life sort of fell apart all at once. In a matter of one day, I lost my job, my business, my company car, and my place to live for reasons that I won't go into detail about here. Let's just say that I was screwed over by my business partner, and that's that. At the time, I had just enough money to either buy a junker vehicle or put down a security deposit and first month's rent on an apartment. I'm a rather resourceful guy, and I opted for the vehicle. I figured a car was a better move, as I could live in it for as long as it took to get my life together, and it would give me more options for finding a new job. I had lost everything, but I had two things: a full set of camping gear and a girlfriend who still loved me. So I figured I could rough it outside in the cold winter nights until I found a new car and a job. At the time, I had been living in a town that was located on the edge of the Pine Barrens wilderness of southern New Jersey. For those who have never heard of it, the Pine Barrens is a rather unique 1 million acre forest of mostly pine trees that has lots of deer, turkey, coyotes, and some unique prehistoric type plants that only grow in that area. My girlfriend at the time lived with her parents, and despite the fact that they barely knew me, she had convinced them to take me in. But I was uncomfortable with that idea and refused the offer. As you can imagine, my girlfriend was beside herself with worry, but she knew I was too proud and just accepted my crazy decision to live outdoors in the wintertime. I chose a spot on the edge of the neighborhood that I had been previously living in, near a dirt storage clearing that was being used to dump and store dirt to build a new development of homes. I found a large path into the woods and made a stealth camp only about a quarter-mile deep into the Pine Barrens. I would sleep in the woods at night, and in the mornings I would make the short walk into civilization, where my woman would pick me up. Once she came to get me, I would use her car to drive her to work, and then spend the day looking for a vehicle and a new job. I would also take an hour or so to head to the gym to work out and get a shower each day. Around 5 p.m. I would pick her up at work, and she would drop me back off near my campsite. Wednesday, December 3rd was about to be my fifth and final night in that particular patch of woods. By then, I had found a job that I was to start in a few weeks and had purchased an old SUV. It was still at the used car lot, as my new car insurance would not be active until the following day. My new job didn't start for a month, but I had already paid for a real campsite far away in another area of the Pine Barrens that I could live in until then. This way, I could have big fires, ride my mountain bike through the trails, and not have to sneak in and out each morning and evening. So December 3rd, 2014 was my last night at my stealth camp on the edge of town. To this day, I enjoy winter camping, and even then, I had done so many times before in my life, I had a routine setup. I used to camp in cold weather. I always encapsulated my tent with a large heavy-duty camo tarp. This keeps the weather out very effectively. It also helps to trap a little heat for comfort, but unfortunately, it makes it so that you can't see outside without lifting the tarp up at your tent entrance to look around. By 8 p.m. or so, I had finished eating and was relaxing, just puffing on my vape and feeling happy that I would be in a much more comfortable situation the next day. Just like every other night at this location at this time, a pack of coyotes would be right outside my tent, raising hell. Each night around 8 p.m., they would gather right outside in front of my tent and fight, yelp, and run around. The first 2 nights I was sort of shocked, but by this time I was used to them and was sure they didn't have the balls to dare attack a full-grown human. But I still slept with a 26-inch, very sharp, full-tang short sword at my side each night, just in case. I was lying on my back in the tent, starting to doze off to the sound of the coyote pack, when they all started yipping and suddenly ran off into the deep woods together. During the previous nights, they would slowly leave the area as a group, continuing to scrap and circle the general area. So this sudden departure sort of piqued my interest, and I opened my eyes to listen. It was dead silent. After a minute or so, I started getting ready to doze off again when a powerful and unpleasant stench filled my tent. I can't begin to explain how overwhelming and terrible the stench was. I sat up in my tent and stuck my face inside my coat to escape it. It was no use. There was no escaping the smell. It was a combination of extremely bad body odor mixed with dirty feet, skunk, and whatever, fill in the blank. I was too overwhelmed by the odor to even ponder what was making it. It was strong enough to make me feel sick. I remember at one point trying to avoid the smell by breathing through my mouth, and the odor was so strong that I could taste it on the tip of my tongue. I was at the point of holding my breath, and whatever it was that was stinking up my campsite needed to go the hell away, so I decided to go outside my tent and run whatever it was off. I unsheathed my sword and started to unzip the tent entrance when I heard someone walking down the path in the woods that was located behind my camp. I say someone instead of something because it was clearly a person walking on 2 feet. I slowly zipped the tent back up and went silent. The path was pretty well traveled during the day by locals walking their dogs and my neighborhood kids, but this was the first time at night that I had heard someone using the path. Whoever it was big and heavy because I could actually hear the thud of their feet impacting the dirt path with each step. I had made my stealth camp pretty close to the path for ease of use, but I had camouflaged it so well behind an earth mound with brush and a camo tarp that one could walk within a few yards of it and not see it. The footsteps stopped, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of whoever it was leave the dirt path and slowly walk into the woods behind me to my left. My heart sank and adrenaline filled my bloodstream. I had made it for 4 nights undetected, and on my last night, I was about to get found out. I'm sure I was on some kind of private property, and with all the bullshit going on in my life at that time, the last thing I needed was for the cops to arrest me and break up my camp. Like I said, my camp was well hidden, and it showed no signs of anyone being there while I was gone, so I was wondering why this person was heading towards me. This whole time the stench was just as strong as ever, but had taken backstage in my mind to the current new situation at hand. I could hear whoever it was carefully and slowly walking closer and closer until they were maybe 20 feet off to my left. They sounded like the footsteps of someone trying to sneak up on something or someone else. They stopped at my left side for a moment and then started to walk at a normal noisy pace through the leaves until they were about 15 or 20 yards from my tent in the area where the coyotes would congregate each night. Then they stopped. I could hear deep hoarse breathing like a giant monster catching its breath. I was paralyzed with fear. My heart was pounding out of my chest. Then it walked right up to the front of my tent. I clutched my blade and held my breath. Next, whatever it was walked very slowly around to the right side of my tent, still breathing deep and heavy. Then it leaned itself right up to the wall of my tent and started to sniff loudly. It took long, deep, sniffing noises through its nose and would exhale through its mouth. I was terrified as its face was just feet away from me. At this point, I was growing confused. The only logical thing I could think of was that a bear was right outside of my tent. But the thing is that bears are almost non-existent in the Pine Barrens, especially so close to a busy construction site. But I thought to myself, what else could it be? Nothing was making sense. I was sure that I had heard a person on 2 feet walking this whole time, but no human, no matter how dirty and homeless, could smell that powerfully. Plus, the breathing I was hearing sounded more like a giant monster than a human. But monsters aren't real, right? So I rationalized that it had to be a bear. At this point, I had to do something. I figured I would say something out loud. It was a giant smelly person. I could probably get a response, and if it was indeed a bear, there was a 99.99% chance it would run for its life once it realized that there was a human in the tent. One thing I knew was that black bears are terrified of humans. So I took a deep breath and said loudly and sharply, "Who's there?" And then I whacked the side of the tent it was standing at with a hard and quick backhand. The thing took 2 steps back, and to my absolute horror, it let out the deepest, most terrifying growl I've ever heard. At this point, my heart stopped and I almost pooped my pants. It was a long and very deep growl, just like a dog's, but sounded like a dog that would have weighed about 800 pounds. I sat there with my blade poised, in shock, terrified, and waited for whatever it was to rip through the tarp and kill me on the spot. After what was probably a 5 to 10 second growl, it went silent, and all I could hear was the deafening noise of my pulse pounding in my head. Then suddenly, to my surprise, it walked away into the forest. I could hear the sound of a creature on 2 legs, crushing the dried leaves and twigs underfoot as it walked away. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath until I could not hear it walking anymore. Then I took a deep breath and almost collapsed with relief in the tent. The horrible stench began to get less and less until it finally went away. I was feeling relieved, and my heart was starting to finally calm down when suddenly I heard a sound of what could only be a large tree branch being snapped quickly from a tree, or snapped in half, followed by being smashed into a tree or other piece of wood. Right after that, it made a noise that sounded like a single, very loud dog bark, followed by what I can only describe as the sound of a woman screaming. My heart jumped to full turbo mode once again, and I broke out into a cold sweat. After that, I heard nothing else. And it took a good 20 minutes for me to calm down. When the adrenaline finally subsided, I was overwhelmed with exhaustion. I reasoned that if it wanted to do me harm, it would have, and at this point, it was safe to fall asleep. Interestingly, I had one of the best night's sleep I've ever had. In the morning, I packed everything up and got the hell out of there. My girlfriend picked me up that morning. She took one look at me and asked me why I looked so disturbed. I told her what happened, and she said it must have been one of the coyotes and that I was being dramatic. To this day, the only people who believe me are my brother and my 13-year-old son. I had always told myself that it was a bear. I couldn't come up with any other logical conclusion. But like I said, black bears are all but non-existent in the Pine Barrens. Also, since then, I have done the research and have learned that bears do not have a strong odor at all, even during mating season or while hibernating. The thought of it being a Sasquatch never even crossed my mind at the time, because I thought they only existed in the northwestern United States and Canada. That, if they existed at all. Besides, what would a mythical creature like that be doing hanging out next to a fairly populated New Jersey town like that? Since then, I've educated myself on Bigfoot, and now I'm pretty sure I was a Sasquatch that scared the poop out of me that night. I suppose I will never really know. My life is not perfect, and it's hard to believe that just over 5 years ago I was homeless in the woods of New Jersey. I still go to winter camping almost every year by myself, but now that I know monsters are real, I will only go to wilderness areas where I'm allowed to carry a big bore revolver or 12 gauge with slugs.